On March 4, 1861, outgoing President James Buchanan and President-elect Abraham Lincoln entered the chamber of the U.S. Senate and took seats in front of the Secretary's desk to watch outgoing Vice President John C. Breckinridge administer the oath of office to Hannibal Hamlin, Lincoln's running mate. After asking the Senate to accept my gratitude and my cordial good wishes for your prosperity and happiness, Breckinridge swore in Hamlin, who then swore in the new senators, one of whom happened to be now former Vice President John C. Breckinridge, representing Kentucky. Breckinridge then warmly shook hands with William H. Seward, an abolitionist Republican from New York who was leaving the Senate to serve as Lincoln's Secretary of State. Although the two were political opposites, Seward liked Breckinridge, who, unlike today's vice presidents, actually fulfilled his role as president of the Senate, not leaving things to a pro tem and only showing up to cast the occasional tie-breaking vote. The two men toasted each other at dinner parties, and in 1858, Seward had praised Breckinridge's fairness and impartiality on the Senate floor. Now, as they left the Senate together to hear Lincoln deliver his inaugural address, it must have seemed unthinkable that 6 months later, Breckinridge, a well-liked moderate whose state remained in the Union, would flee into Confederate territory to avoid arrest and take up arms against the United States. Breckinridge had enjoyed a meteoric rise in the Democratic Party, becoming the youngest vice president in U.S. history at 35, after having served just 2 terms in the House of Representatives. He had gone to the 1856 Democratic Convention as a delegate supporting Lynn Boyd, another Kentuckian, for the vice presidency, but the party instead nominated Breckinridge over his protests. Doing so was a way to throw a bone to supporters of Stephen A. Douglas, who were disappointed that Buchanan had been nominated for president instead of Douglas, who had allied with Breckinridge in Congress to get the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed. When the 1960 Charleston Convention came around, Breckinridge was again backing another Kentuckian, James Guthrie, this time for the presidency, and forbade his surrogates to place his own name in nomination unless and until Guthrie withdrew. Guthrie did not withdraw, even though he was trailing Douglas by an insurmountable margin, and in the meantime the walkout of Southern delegates, led by Alabama fire eater William Lowndes Yancey, split the party in two. As historian William C. Davis writes, later, after the Charleston debacle led to another convention in Baltimore where the party split, the Southern Rights faction did choose him. He reluctantly accepted the nomination when he was persuaded that his doing so would force Douglas to pull out of the race. Then Breckinridge, too, would withdraw, and the party could yet unite behind a compromise candidate to defeat the Republicans in November. Douglas, whose alliance with Breckinridge had frayed in the intervening years, did not pull out. With his opposition split 3 ways, Lincoln won the presidency with 39% of the popular vote and without carrying a single Southern state. Historian Frank H. Heck wrote of the untenable position Breckinridge had found himself in ever since being nominated by the Southern Democrats. There was nothing in any of Breckinridge's public utterances to support the view that he shared the Southern nationalism of some of his political friends from the Deep South, although his sympathies were no doubt with the Confederate States from the moment of their creation. Breckinridge, certainly from his acceptance of the presidential nomination, was an object of suspicion. In the view of those who wished him to take a firm stand for the secession of Kentucky at any stage of the unfolding of events, and even in the eyes of some of their opponents, he lacked force and decisiveness. He had no deficit of personal courage, but his loyalties, his prejudices, and perhaps his ambition pulled him in diverse directions. Basically, he was a moderate man, considerate and courteous even under heavy provocation, a scrupulous man who hesitated to promise what he could not perform or to lead people where they did not wish to go. The very excellence of his personal qualities unsuited him for leadership in the great crisis of disunion. At least now that Breckinridge was a senator, he could speak his mind more freely than as vice president. But with the writ of habeas corpus suspended and indefinite imprisonment an available punishment, doing so carried a cost, as Davis writes. His continual declarations against Lincoln's war policy and his attempts to maintain Kentucky's neutrality against an overwhelming Union sentiment in the state seemed final proof that John C. Breckinridge was disloyal. In September, though he had committed no disloyal or treasonable act other than to speak his mind on the Senate floor, Breckinridge was ordered arrested. Before the Federals could capture him, he fled south to the Confederacy. Just prior to his departure, he met with old friends in Frankfurt and confided to them his belief that the Confederacy could not succeed. Yet there was nowhere else for him to go. Further, he entertained the faint hope the united bloc of slave states, Kentucky included, might force Lincoln to negotiate congressional and constitutional guarantees that would allow the South to return to the Union. Jefferson Davis flirted with the idea of making Breckinridge Secretary of War before deciding he would be more valuable in the field, and indeed Breckinridge, who rose to the rank of Major General, served with distinction. He participated in some of the biggest Confederate victories and led troops in every border state but Missouri and in every Confederate state but Texas, as well as the District of Columbia. Finally, in January 1865, after burning through a series of ineffective war secretaries and needing someone both competent and popular, the president gave the post to Breckinridge, who became the first holder of that office to voice disagreements with Davis to his face and with whom the president discussed war policy as an equal. As William C. Davis writes, barely a month after taking over, Breckinridge was convinced, as he had been 4 years before, that the South could not win the war. As a result, his every effort he bent toward bringing about an honorable peace. Without Davis's knowledge, he brought together influential members of Congress to win their support. What I propose, he told them, is this: that the Confederacy should not be captured in fragments, that we should not disband like bandits, but that we should surrender as a government, and that we will thus maintain the dignity of our cause and secure the respect of our enemies and the best terms for our soldiers. He well knew that Davis hoped to continue the conflict to the death, operating as guerrillas in the hills if necessary. Breckinridge, ever mindful of history, would not countenance such a demise for the South. This has been a magnificent epic, he told the congressman. In God's name, let it not terminate in a farce. That it did not so end is in large measure due to his influence. With the fall of Richmond and the flight of the cabinet, it was Breckinridge who, sometimes alone, constantly pressured Davis to surrender. Finally, he succeeded. One of his last acts, too, was the preservation of the War Department archives, which he ordered turned over intact to the Federals. Having done so much to ensure an honorable end for the Confederacy, he did even more to allow future historians to tell and interpret the story of that magnificent epic. For me, one parallel between Breckinridge's brief tenures as U.S. Senator and as Confederate Secretary of War stands out. Heck writes that on the Senate floor in the summer of 1861, when asked what he would do in the existing situation, with the hostile army encamped but a few miles from the national capital, Breckinridge declared flatly that he would abandon the war, that he did not hold that constitutional liberty is bound up in this fratricidal, devastating, horrible contest. Upon the contrary, I fear it will find its grave in it. Sir, I would prefer to see these states all reunited upon true constitutional principles to any other object that could be offered me in life, but I infinitely prefer to see a peaceful separation of these states than to see endless, aimless, devastating war, at the end of which I see the grave of public liberty and of personal freedom. Thus Breckinridge, an anti-coercion unionist around whom secessionists had rallied in 1860, spoke out for abandoning the Civil War in favor of peace as a member of both the U.S. and Confederate governments. I have more of his story in a companion post at my website, where you can also sign up to get the post delivered for free to your inbox. If you'd like to support this channel, I'd be super thankful if you clicked the super thanks button below the video. It also helps if you hit the like button, subscribe, comment with your thoughts on Breckinridge, and share with anyone who might be interested. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.